Fredericton Silverwood has second reading of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a pleasure to rise in the House today in support of Bill 54, the Artificial Tanning Act. Mr. Speaker, I sat through quite a long speech last night from the member for Dalhousie Restigouche East, and one of his key questions that he continued on today is why this matter is being referred potentially to the Health Committee. And I would like to take this moment at the start of my speech just to remind members that the intention of putting in place a Health Committee was to develop within that committee a subject matter expertise. And this would be an opportunity, potentially, if it was the will of the House, to move this bill to consideration by that committee to allow them to develop their expertise. So I want to just put that to bed. Mr. Speaker, for over a year now, I've been working with leaders in the tanning industry, members of the Joint Canadian Tanning Association, in particular members Frank Finlay, who's a regional director, and Randy Collette. The Joint Canadian Tanning Association represents 1,600 salons across the country, and in my dealings with this group, I found them to be very open-minded, to be very professional, and to be organized. And Mr. Speaker, from the very beginning, they've been supportive of the concept of regulation. So I think it's important at the outset to understand that this bill is in cooperation with the tanning industry. And in fact, they've been implementing guidelines that are very similar to this bill for well over a year now, and they've been doing that without it becoming law. They've been doing it very successfully. Now let's just take a snapshot of the industry here in New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. There's over 200 facilities in New Brunswick, about 5 workers in each. These are all, generally speaking, small business, locally owned operations, and that accounts for about 1,000 full-time jobs in New Brunswick. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I found this to be a very professional industry. They have, on their own, instituted mandatory skin typing, which has resulted in a prohibition for those of skin type 1. They've also done training and certification for their staff. They encourage a progressive tanning regime, so they don't let just people go and sit in the beds and bake. They work them up to a certain level. And they have an organized professional body. So I'm impressed with the quality of the professionals in this industry. Like I say, this is something that's been done in cooperation with the tanning industry, and I want to compliment the current Minister of Health, and indeed the previous Minister, because in my dealings with them, they were always very forthcoming in dealing with the industry and had a very cooperative attitude. And I want to compliment our current Minister and indeed the previous Minister of Health for having the leadership to bring this bill forward. As well, this bill has been developed in conjunction with the Canadian Cancer Society, so there are a lot of points of view represented. Now, Mr. Speaker, I got to tell you, my gut instinct on such bills is often not to support them, because I'm not a big fan of the nanny state, and I have my concerns. I don't consider myself a libertarian, but certainly I believe that in most cases, it's better if we let the people decide things. I trust the people, and I believe they should have the right to make their own decisions. That's right. But in this case, it does pertain to minors, and there are some cases where it is, of course, in the public good to legislate, particularly on public health issues, and this is one of them. Other examples of certainly are, bicycle helmets. We legislate those. We legislate seat belts. We have age regulations in place for other activities such as driving, the age of consent, voting, drinking, and of course, Mr. Speaker, smoking, which is directly parallel in the fact that it's highly carcinogenic, such as UV tanning can be. And really the principle that underlies, I think, the need for legislation in public health issues is the fact that we as the public bear the burden for the medical costs. So if someone does an activity that endangers their health, it's not just their problem. Ultimately, it's our problem because we are paying the bills for their medical care. And so in a situation where we have socialized medicine, we should therefore also have some legislation that regulates the degree to which people can do themselves harm. Now, Mr. Speaker, the case for legislating tanning, which lies behind this bill, is in fact a medical case. There's a medical argument and a strong medical case that suggests that exposure to UV light in concentrated amounts, particularly at young ages, can lead directly to skin cancer. And we've heard offered on the floor of this legislature a lot of facts surrounding that. And this is based on scientific medical evidence that UV tanning, particularly at an early age, can increase the incidence of skin cancer. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say, if the case surrounding this legislation is based on a medical argument, then it also stands to reason that perhaps in the legislation there might be room for a medical exemption. And such an exemption could potentially allow some people to tan that suffer from certain skin conditions. So if a doctor were to prescribe a kind of treatment, a UV-based treatment, that would perhaps be something that we could allow under the law. So that is something I hope that the Minister of Health will give due consideration to. Because in fact, some skin types can actually benefit from UV tanning, and it can be a very expedient way of dealing with some skin conditions. And often when we prescribe medication, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to consider that medications are not always simply good for you. In some cases, they have negative consequences and they have positive consequences, and doctors who are trained to do it must decide what is best for their patients. And the patients, in fact, have a say in that, and they can understand when a course of treatment is good for them. For example, my mother just recently had a knee operation and a hip operation. Well, let me tell you, it was a painful process. She made it through, and she's better off at the end of it. So in this case, yes, although there are some certainly problems with UV tanning, in some cases it can actually have a positive medical benefit if it's dealt with by a medical professional. Mr. Speaker, one of the parts of this law that I think we could maybe tighten up a little bit is the issue of self-service tanning. Now, in the United Kingdom, when they brought in tanning legislation, similar to what we're doing here today, it resulted in a 50% increase in self-serve tanning beds. And just so you're aware, Mr. Speaker, I mean, a lot of tanning salons, most reputable professional tanning salons, the kinds that are governed by the JCTA that I've described to you already, those tanning salons have trained professionals. And I described earlier the nature of their training. But often you'll find in other cases standalone beds that are either coin-operated or swipe-operated, and there's no one monitoring that. So, Mr. Speaker, an unintended consequence of this positive legislation could potentially be to grow this industry around unsupervised tanning beds. And in fact, that could have the opposite effect that we're desiring. We want to decrease, by this legislation, we want to decrease the number of minors who are endangering themselves to UV light and therefore to skin cancer. But in fact, by bringing this law into force, without a ban on self-serve tanning beds, there's the potential there that in fact more minors could have access, or certainly continue their access through another means. So I think we need to think about that as this bill moves through the system. I think it's important that we encourage our salons to maintain that professional control that we've discussed earlier. Mr. Speaker, there is a provision in the law, clause number 4, which relates to the posting of signs. And I think it's a great provision, and it basically says, let me read it. An operator shall post signs provided by the minister that state that prohibitions and the adverse health effects of artificial tanning in clearly visible and prominent places in a commercial tanning operation. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that our government has the prudence to make sure these are reasonable signs, but I'm not sure what a future government might do. And so whenever we put into law the power to the government to force someone to do something, I think it also has to have a degree of a test of reasonability to it. And so I would just caution, because often when these laws are put into effect, they go back and look at the intent of the legislators at the time they were put into effect. So I want to state for the record that it's important that these signs be reasonable, Mr. Speaker, and that they're not overly inflating the statistics. And as well, Mr. Speaker, there's provisions in the law in paragraph 5 that deal with advertising. And certainly it says that artificial tanning is beneficial to, that advertising should be prohibited that says that artificial tanning is beneficial to a person's health. I think it's important to keep that in the legislation. That's very important. But I would suggest maybe that the other subsections that follow in paragraph 5, and I won't read those, but they're in the law, I would suggest that maybe those are not necessary. That provision dealing with the prohibition on advertising the health benefits, that should stand, but the other enunciations of those prohibitions, maybe those could be changed around. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the question of age has come up. And as we've predicated this bill on the basis of a medical argument, I hope that when we move this into law and pick an age, right now in the legislation proposed it says 19 years. I don't personally have a challenge with 19 years. 18 years was the guideline that was put into effect last year, and that's worked very well. But I hope that whatever age is chosen, that, Mr. Speaker, that's based on a medical argument and not on a legal argument. Because as I've said, this bill will become a law, but it's based on a medical case. And so I believe the age chosen should similarly be based on that medical case. And, Mr. Speaker, there is one other little thing that I would like to see considered when we move this bill through the system. That is, in fact, the title of the bill. The title of the bill right now is the Artificial Tanning Act, and I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that we should consider naming the act the Artificial UV or Ultraviolet Tanning Act, because as you're probably aware, there are a number of other non-carcinogenic forms of artificial tanning, spray tans, other types of tanning that I'm not that familiar with, because you could tell by my complexion I don't get much of an occasion to tan. But I know that there are other methods of tanning out there, Mr. Speaker, and the intent of this bill is to deal specifically with ultraviolet tanning, and so I think we should just clearly make that point in the title of the bill. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I really support the intent of this bill. I think it's great. The aim here is to decrease minors' possibility of getting skin cancer. And we do that by prohibiting tanning under a certain age based on a medical argument. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that's where we should be going. And I think it is reasonable in this case to limit individual liberties because it is for the public good. These are reasonable limits. But I would want to underline, finally, that it is based on a medical argument, and so all points within the bill, therefore, should be similarly based on a medical argument. And I would argue, therefore, that a medical exemption is something that should be considered, that a ban on self-service tanning so as not to induce an unintended consequence of this act, that should be considered potentially, that signage, Mr. Speaker, be reasonable and appropriate, and finally, that the age chosen should be based on a medical case rather than arbitrary or tying it to some other legal age. So, Mr. Speaker, it's been a pleasure to speak of this bill, and I would want to conclude by saying, of course, I will vote in favor of the intent of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.